Seized. That's the word no one in Washington or Ottawa is saying out loud. But it's the word that defines everything happening right now between these two nations. Canadian energy contracts seized by new sovereignty mandates. American leverage over its closest ally seized back by a former central banker who just outmaneuvered a sitting president. And your financial future, your pension, your 401k, your retirement, seized by a trade war that neither government will admit has already begun. $400 billion in cross-border trade seized from the foundation of North American stability and dangled over a cliff. What I'm about to walk you through isn't speculation, it's not theory. It is the documented, verifiable dismantling of the most important economic relationship on this continent. And no one on mainstream cable news is telling you the full truth about what happens next. And before we go any further, if this is the first time you're hearing any of this broken down like this, there's a reason. This channel exists for exactly this moment. Subscribe to CND Breaking News, where global power shifts are exposed before it's too late. Hit the bell, because what I'm about to lay out in the next 12 minutes will affect your wallet, your retirement, and the country your grandchildren inherit. And you need to hear it first, not filtered through people who are paid to keep you calm. Now, let's talk about steel. On Thursday, March 28th, 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood in front of Parliament and did something no Canadian leader has ever done. He didn't just announce a policy. He didn't just hold a press conference. He announced what he called permanent economic sovereignty measures. Not temporary, not conditional, permanent. He looked directly into the camera and told the world that Canada is building trade infrastructure that completely bypasses American markets. And he's already signed preliminary agreements with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and here's the part that should terrify the White House: Mexico. Canada just pulled Trump's own USMCA partner into a separate corridor that geographically isolates the United States. But let me rewind, because to understand what Carney just built, you need to understand what Trump threatened to destroy. 3 weeks earlier, February 28th, Donald Trump went on Truth Social at 3:47 in the morning, because of course he did, and floated 25% tariffs on all Canadian imports: lumber, oil, natural gas, electricity, aluminum, and steel. Now, I need you to understand something about steel tariffs that almost nobody in media explains honestly, because they think you won't follow the economics. But I know you will, because you've lived through enough economic cycles to know when someone's picking your pocket and calling it patriotism. A 25% tariff on Canadian steel is not a tax on Canada. It's a tax on you. Let me explain why. When steel gets more expensive, everything made with steel gets more expensive. The car in your driveway, roughly 2,400 pounds of steel. A 25% tariff on Canadian steel adds between $1,200 and $1,800 to the cost of a new vehicle. The home your children are trying to buy: steel beams, steel rebar, steel framing. A tariff at that level adds $8,000 to $14,000 to the cost of new construction in a housing market that's already crushing young families. The bridge you drive over, the hospital where you get your prescriptions, the power grid that keeps your lights on, all steel, all more expensive. And who pays? Not Canada, not Beijing, you, the American consumer. The American retiree on a fixed income watching the purchasing power of every dollar you saved get eaten alive by artificial inflation created by your own government. But here's where it gets worse, because Trump didn't stop at 25%. By mid-March, his own trade advisors were floating the idea of 50% tariffs as a pressure mechanism, what analysts have started calling a steel wall. Not a wall on the border, a wall around the American economy. 50% tariffs designed to punish Canada that would in practice punish every American who buys a car, pays rent, heats a home, or uses an appliance. The steel that built our cities is now being used as a weapon of economic war. Let me say that again so it sinks in. The steel that built your cities, that framed the home you raised your family in, is now a weapon, and it's pointed at you. And Mark Carney, he didn't flinch. He waited 48 hours, radio silence from Ottawa, no panic, no emergency cabinet photo ops, nothing. And then on March 2nd, he gave a 6-minute address, so calm, so measured, so absolutely devastating that Trump deleted his original Truth Social post within 2 hours. Carney said, quote, "We have modeled every economic scenario involving American tariffs. We have contingency plans that have been in development since 2016. If the United States chooses economic warfare, Canada will not retaliate. We will simply move forward without them. Without them. Not against them. Without them." That's not anger. That's not bluster. That's a man who ran the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, who understands monetary systems at a level Trump can't even pronounce. Telling the most powerful country on earth, we don't need you anymore. So let me tell you where we are now, because this isn't a trade dispute anymore. Let's stop using that word. Trade disputes have negotiations. They have off-ramps. They have adults in the room who eventually shake hands. This is an economic war. And in every war, every single one, it's not the generals who bleed. It's not the presidents who go hungry. It's ordinary people. It's the middle class. It's retirees. It's the people who played by the rules their entire lives and are now watching the system those rules were built on get torn apart by men who will never feel the consequences. Let me give you the numbers, the real numbers, that Washington and Ottawa don't want on the same page at the same time. $400 billion. That's the annual value of US-Canada trade now at risk, not in some theoretical future. Right now, as Carney's sovereignty framework rolls out and Trump's tariff threats harden into policy. Billions, with a B, in Canadian energy, pharmaceutical, and raw material exports that American consumers and industries depend on, now being redirected to Europe, Asia, and the Commonwealth. And when you add it all up, when you calculate the integrated supply chains, the energy dependencies, the financial instruments, the pension fund exposures on both sides of the border, you're looking at trillions in North American economic value facing collapse. Not decline, not correction, collapse. And who is in the blast radius you are? Your retirement is tied to a system that is currently being dismantled. Let me be specific, because you deserve specifics, not talking points. Canada supplies 31% of American oil imports. Trump just threatened to tariff the resource that keeps American cars running, while gas is already $4.50 a gallon in California. 60% of electricity in northern states, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, comes from Canadian hydroelectric power. All swing states. All go dark if Canada turns off the switch. Canadian pharmacies supply 43% of prescription medications to border states. Because American pharmaceutical companies charge 300% markups. Trump wants to put tariffs on insulin that Americans cross the border to afford. If you're 62 years old and diabetic in Montana, this isn't a policy debate, it's a death sentence with a flag on it. And then there's the nuclear option, and I mean that literally. Canada controls 17% of global uranium production. You know what needs uranium? Nuclear power plants. The same ones the Republican Party has been pushing as the future of American energy independence. You know who can't build a single new reactor without Canadian uranium? The United States of America. Carney knows all of this. He had economists run the numbers for 8 years while he was waiting to become prime minister. Trump knows none of this, because Trump doesn't read briefings that don't have his name in bold every 3 sentences. And while Trump was rage posting at 4 a.m. about lying Canadian Carney, Ursula von der Leyen, president of the European Commission, got on a plane and flew to Ottawa. Not a video call, not a diplomatic envoy. She flew there personally, and when reporters asked why, she smiled and said, because Canada is about to become the most important trading partner the EU has in North America. In North America. She didn't say the Western Hemisphere. She said North America, which means the United States is no longer the EU's primary consideration on this continent. They signed a preliminary agreement that creates a transatlantic rare earth mineral supply chain that completely excludes the United States, Canada's rare earth deposits in the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, undeveloped for decades because it was cheaper to trade with the US, are now being shipped to Europe, processed with green energy, built into a technology supply chain that makes both the EU and Canada independent of both American and Chinese rare earth materials. And in Mexico, the poetic justice that almost makes you believe in karma, President Claudia Sheinbaum flew to Toronto on March 14th, met with Carney at a private residence, no press, 11 hours, and they announced the Great Lakes Trade Corridor, a route using Canadian rail to move Mexican goods to Canadian ports, then on to Europe and Asia, without ever touching American soil. Mexico gets access to the Atlantic without Gulf Coast bottlenecks. Canada gets manufacturing partnerships that replace American contracts. And the United States? The United States gets to watch $40 billion in annual logistics revenue vanish and another $70 billion in joint Canada-Mexico manufacturing ventures that bypass American industry entirely. The USMCA doesn't expire until 2026, but Carney figured out something brilliant. You don't need to withdraw from a trade agreement to make it irrelevant. You just build alternative infrastructure so comprehensive that the agreement becomes a formality. A piece of paper with no economic gravity behind it. And how is he funding this? $800 billion in infrastructure investment, new ports on Hudson Bay, expanded rail lines to Mexican manufacturing hubs, an overhaul of the St. Lawrence Seaway, and he's financing it with Canadian pension funds, some of the largest, most stable investment pools in the world, reclassified under a national security priority so they can invest at below market returns in the public interest. He's building an economic fortress with retirement money, and it's completely legal. Meanwhile, what is Congress doing? Nothing. 3 Republican senators from states that depend on Canadian trade have been caught on hot mics saying some version of, he's going to destroy us. Senator John Hoeven of North Dakota said Canadian oil is the only reason Midwest refineries exist. He voted for the tariff proposal anyway. Susan Collins called it economic suicide at a town hall, then went on Fox News and said she trusts the president's strategy. They're more afraid of Trump's base than they are of economic collapse. And that is why this is a war. Not because anyone declared it, but because the people in power are choosing political survival over your financial survival. They are sacrificing the middle class, your generation, the one that built the post-war economy, on the altar of a man who has never calculated anything more complex than his own approval ratings. You worked 30, 40 years. You paid into a system. You were promised that the alliances, the trade deals, the institutions would hold. And now you're watching them be incinerated by a 3 a.m. Truth Social post, and no one in Washington has the courage to grab the fire extinguisher. So let me bring this to the place that no one in American media wants to go, because it sounds too dramatic, too final. But final is the right word. What you are watching is not a rough patch, it's not a negotiating tactic. It is the permanent divorce of the United States and Canada, a North American collapse that will reshape this continent for the rest of your lifetime and your children's lifetimes. Carney laid out 5 sovereignty pillars: energy independence, pharmaceutical security, manufacturing partnerships with Mexico, rare earth mineral rights restricted to allied nations, and full technology and data sovereignty. Each one is designed by design to make the United States irrelevant to Canadian economic planning. And Trump's response, he posted at 6:43 p.m., "Pathetic Mark Carney thinks he can threaten the greatest economy in history. Canada is a weak country with no military and no power. They will come crawling back when their economy collapses. I give them 2 weeks. 2 weeks. It has been 72 hours. The Canadian dollar is up 4% against the US dollar." The Toronto Stock Exchange hit a record high. Applications for Canadian permanent residency from American citizens have increased 900%. Americans, your neighbors, your colleagues, your children, are fleeing to Canada because they trust a former central banker's economic framework more than a reality television host's temper tantrums. And here's the question I haven't heard a single American anchor ask on air. What if Canada is right? What if the special relationship was only special because Canada kept making concessions and America kept taking credit? What if this isn't Canada abandoning the United States, but Canada finally standing up after decades of being insulted, threatened, and taken for granted by a country that confused loyalty with submission? Trump called their steel a national security threat. Their steel, Canada. Our closest ally, he blamed them for the opioid crisis when the DEA's own data says 93% of fentanyl comes through the southern border. He demanded increased military spending while simultaneously threatening trade war, and every time Canadian officials tried to negotiate, they were met with insults and 3 a.m. tweets and expected to smile at the next summit. Carney looked at that pattern and made the only rational calculation: this isn't going to get better. American politics have fundamentally changed. The institutions that constrain presidential power are broken, and Canada must prepare for a future where the United States is not a reliable partner. That's not aggression. That's self-respect. And the fact that self-respect looks like betrayal to Washington tells you everything about how entitled the American foreign policy establishment has become. Now, here's the part that should keep every American strategist awake at night. Carney had an unscheduled call on March 19th with the Prime Minister of Australia. Australia, which controls 28% of global lithium. Combined with Canada's uranium and rare earths, that's a resource alliance that could supply the entire democratic world's green energy, nuclear power, and advanced technology needs. Bring in New Zealand. The United Kingdom, India, which has been making overtures about Commonwealth trade revival. You're looking at an economic bloc that controls the 21st century's most critical resources, and the United States is not in it. Trump is so focused on China that he's completely ignored the possibility that America's own allies would just build a parallel system and leave the US behind. This is the collapse. Not a stock market crash, not a single catastrophic event. It's a slow, structural unwinding of every assumption that has governed North American power for 70 years. It's the end of the era where geography guaranteed American dominance on this continent. And for those of you watching who are 50, 60, 70 years old, who remember when the US-Canada relationship was the model for how democracies cooperate, I need you to understand what has been lost. Not temporarily, not for a news cycle. The trust is gone, and trust, once broken at this scale, does not come back in your lifetime. The special relationship between the United States and Canada, the one your generation built, is over. And it was destroyed not by an enemy, not by a rival, but by our own president for the price of a Truth Social post and a round of applause at a rally. $400 billion in trade, weaponized, a 70-year alliance, severed, trillions in North American value, crumbling. And right now, someone in Washington is drafting the next tariff. Someone in Ottawa is signing the next sovereignty agreement. And someone in your family is checking their retirement account and wondering why it feels like the ground is moving beneath them. It's moving because it is. The steel wall isn't on the border. It's around your future. And the men who built it will never live behind it. Subscribe to CNV Breaking News. Share this with someone who needs to hear it before April. Because the 2-week clock Trump set, it's already ticking. And when it hits 0, it won't be Canada that's on its knees.